So, thank you very much. Dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to say a few words to give you an overview of the Franco-British or Brito-French, I don't know how we say, collaboration, which has framed the Kouphovouno project since its beginning and along its development. Here is how it all began. In 1989, I had published the results of the first excavation by von Vacano in 1941, and I wanted to start a new excavation at Kouphovouno. I had taken part in quite a number of archaeological campaigns, but of course, such an undertaking was a little too much for a lonely archaeologist, and some partnership was needed, and that is what I started to look for. For their part, and at the same time, Chris and Bill were interested in finding a new Neolithic site in the same region in view of undertaking an excavation, since they had then completed the Laconia survey and the rural sites project on the opposite bank of the Evrotas River. In 1996, they contacted me, saying that they were interested in a project about Kouphovouno, and I proposed a meeting. So, our first meeting took place in Paris, and it had very positive results. We could begin to lay the groundwork for the future undertaking to be carried out in common. Then, we made our first journey together in Greece, and we had our first meetings with the director of the British school and with the director of the French school. The next step was, of course, to look for funding. If I'm not mistaken, where is Bill? Here. That was the year 1997 of the previous century, when things really started. And what followed is a well-known story. The project was accepted by the Greek Ministry of Culture. It was placed under the authority of the British school. We are, of course, most grateful to both institutions, as well as to INSTAP, British Academy, and many others. But the project also received the scientific and financial support of several French institutions. And without their help, we would probably not have managed to achieve so much on the field. And I wish to thank the French school in Athens, the Centre National de la Recherche Scientifique, and the French universities in which I worked. It was first Université Bretagne Sud in Lorient, then Blaise Pascal in Clermont-Ferrand, and finally Paul Valéry in Montpellier. So, now a little more about our joint venture. Bill and Chris had been close colleagues and friends for a long time, and I have often wondered how they felt after I had offered them a partnership for Kouphovouno. I do think it was not so easy for them to consider an association, a co-direction of such an important project with a person, a third person, and a French lady at that. As for me, I was sure that there was no reason to worry. I knew I was going to work with two perfect gentlemen, and everything would be fine. What came first? That we would be able to agree on common goals. And that is what actually happened. However, even though we shared the same aims, it could happen that we differed about the way to reach them, about the methods to implement, which, all things considered, is easy to comprehend. We were coming from different backgrounds, we had followed different courses, and our scientific references could even differ at times. So there were instances where we happened to be in contradiction with each other. You know, to bring 3 directors onto the same line of thought or of action is not a long fleuve tranquille, we say in French, which means it's not a comfortable ride along a quiet river. And to reach an agreement, the best thing is to vote, and that's what we did. Like good democratic people, although you easily guess what a difficult matter a vote by 3 people can be at times. But we were able to find quick and efficient ways of sharing roles and duties and of meeting our personal expectations. From the very start, Chris had said he wanted to take the pottery in charge. And from the first campaign onwards, he took in charge of the apotheke, where, while he concentrated on studying the pottery, he daily organized the group of students who were in charge of processing the sherds. Thousands and thousands and thousands of sherds passed in Chris's hands and passed under his thorough scrutiny. He soon became our Mr. Pottery. He invested all his energy and passion in studying our pottery, and he was right. As all you know, of course, our pottery is the most beautiful in the world. But Chris went beyond, for he knew how to make pottery speak so that he could inform us about all the Neolithic period, and especially about the transition between the Middle and the Late Neolithic. And the outcome of Chris's studies, of course, reaches far beyond the site of Kouphovouno. Bill, for his part, was in charge of coordinating all our programs and works, of managing the relations with the local Greek authorities, and of creating our database. En résumé, Bill was our general supervisor. Without Bill, nothing would have been possible. For my part, I was permanently on the site to manage the different areas of the excavation, and I sometimes wonder how much of my memory is still taken by the data and the images of those areas, sectors, trenches, contexts, artifacts. So, overall, I do think our collaboration gave fruitful results. I, for one, feel retrospectively very happy to have shared something like an adventure, both scientific and human. I know how much I learned from Chris and Bill. I hope they will also have learned 1 or 2 things from me. Chris had given our trio a name. He called us les Trois Mousquetaires, because there were only 3 of us, whereas Dumas' Mousquetaires were 4. But I thought our motto should be all for Kouphovouno and Kouphovouno for all. And the students, to be sure, had found charming nicknames for each of us, nicknames which borrowed both from French and English. Chris was Monsieur Moi, Bill was Uncle Bill, and I was Mrs. Fox and sometimes Foxy. I think that along the years, the 3 of us managed to build a real team, what we can call a team. And I can only say how sad I am that there are now only 2 mousquetaires, no longer 3. I miss Monsieur Moi, I miss Mr. Me. We all miss Chris Me, the great scientist, the man, our colleague, and our friend. Thank you.
Thank you, Josette, for those very touching words and those very touching thoughts. I remember still the occasion when we first met in Paris, when you taught us whether it's more important to drink beer first and wine afterwards, or wine first and beer afterwards. I still can't quite remember what's the best way. Okay, well, thinking of Chris's achievements, there are many facets to his work. To name just some of them: the Mycenaeans overseas and late Bronze Age international relations, the archaeology of survey, the scientific study of archaeological sediments, the archaeology of death, public engagement of archaeology, his work with Jenny Doole on the Aegean antiquities in Merseyside, or his work with Tony Spalforth with the Oxford Guide to Greece, but also archaeological fieldwork, and the excavations were important to him, not least at Kouphovouno, and that's what I'll talk about largely today. I had the privilege of working with Chris at the site, and he was a dear friend, great fun to be with, and an efficient and reliable and thoughtful colleague, as Josette has just pointed out. And he was also an inspiring teacher, witnessed on this occasion through those of his students who are giving presentations. So, reflecting more specifically on his contributions, certain general themes come to mind. His early work on the Mycenaean finds in the Dodecanese and Anatolia are classic studies of the adoption and spread of cultural features, not least pottery, into an alien context. The survey on Methana, on the other hand, took a closely defined and culturally distinctive geographical territory and reflected on its fluctuating history of identification and reaction to the larger powers that impinged on it. Turning to his more recent articles and our excavations at Kouphovouno, I'd like to draw your attention to his argument on the transition from the Middle Neolithic to the Late Neolithic period, and secondly, his review of the so-called Write-ons. These two touched on themes running through much of his work: style and identity, and how these change through time, and the cultural geography and reach of cultural ideas. And so it's our intention to explore these in the light of his work at Kouphovouno under the broad head of territoriality. What does the archaeology of Middle Neolithic and Late Neolithic at Kouphovouno tell us about the reach of relationships between Neolithic communities? We start with the site itself. Surface survey, artifact collection, coring, and geophysical survey was carried out in 1999 and 2000. And we concluded that the site covered at least 4 hectares, reaching its largest extent in the Middle Neolithic. Estimations of population based on the extent of a site is a very difficult study, but an absolute minimum of 250 people per hectare would imply at least 1,000 souls when the village reached its maximum, and more probably several thousand. Our excavated areas covered just some 6% of this, just a small proportion of the whole site, but indicated a very dense distribution of buildings consistent with, for the Middle Neolithic, a high population. The excavations indicated clusters of small structures, such as those you see in Area C here, typically with a footprint of about 10 square meters. These are very small structures. You might say of them that 2's company and 3 would be a crowd in this sort of community. And this raises, science hasn't yet discovered whether circulating cats by the tail existed in the Neolithic period, but if it did, it was an outside activity, not an inside activity. You couldn't swing a cat inside these houses. But these pictures raise questions of the division between private and public space. Evidence suggests that cooking and serving of food and even pot firing was carried out in the courtyards, which served these groups of houses, probably serving households. They're found both in Area C, which you see in the center of the site, and area G perhaps 30 meters to the south. Here we see the plan of area G, and you can see a very similar design of open courtyards and small passageways dividing up the houses. There are hints in the pottery of a degree of difference from one area to another. Here we see pedestal bowl profiles of the same phase from both areas, from area C, that's numbers 92 to 94, and areas G, 97 to 98. And you can see there are slight differences, if you look at them closely, between one and the other, suggesting, if you like, a certain territoriality that was expressed within the village itself. One thinks of other examples of this sort of thing, argued on other grounds, such as Kotsakis' argument that Sesklo in Thessaly was split into different communities in the center of the site and on the edge of the site. So these observations reflect a territoriality of kin groups or neighborhoods within a larger village. Such a sense of unity and division was found not only within the village, but also in the fields that surrounded the settlement. Here, isotopic analysis has revealed that there were different agricultural regimes. The wheat, for example, the higher on this graph, indicated manuring and watering of the fields, whereas the barley, lower down on the graph, showed a more extensive, less concentrated effort, perhaps in outfields further from the settlement. The intensive inputs in the cultivation of wheat and pulses would surely reflect the household production, that these are groups of people concentrating on small plots of land. But the extensive cultivation of barley, we're less sure of. Quite what does this imply about did it follow the same model, or were there other means of production for the outfields, if you like, as far as this settlement were concerned? Moving beyond the village, note the very different densities. Oh, sorry, these are showing the isotopic results. I won't concentrate on these. Note the very different densities found in the occupation of territories in the Peloponnese on the one hand, and in Thessaly on the other. The results of intensive surveys have confirmed the relative sparsity of middle Neolithic settlement in the peninsula. Not a sherd of middle Neolithic pottery was found on Chris's Methana survey, not a sherd in the Laconia survey. Others, such as the Esseia and Nemea surveys, which you see in the middle and on the right, show a pattern of a more central site with one or two satellites. Contrast this with the much more dense distribution of villages in Thessaly. And the area I picked out in red is roughly the same area as we see for Nemea there. And you can see how many more settlements were concentrated into the same area. So the loosely knit and sparsely occupied pattern in the Peloponnese raises the question, does this imply a different attitude to the ownership and partition of the land in the Middle Neolithic period? But this territoriality of dispersion was not at the same time one of isolation. On the contrary, the pottery shows that these communities were in close contact with one another. The uniformity of the styles in the Peloponnese has long been recognized and commented on. The great scholars Vitelli and Bill Phelps and Tracy Cullen and many of others. And this style is very much a Peloponnesian style. Its distribution outside this Peloponnese is sporadic and a minor component alongside others. Here we see pottery from Diros and Kouphovouno and Urfimis pottery from Lerna. You can see how very similar the styles are from one to another. Cullen suggested that the differences in decorative syntax suggested links between the Peloponnesian sites, perhaps mediated through the exchange of marriage partners or even perhaps raiding between different communities. As at other sites, we do at Kouphovouno find minor traits in the shapes and decoration of Urfimis pottery specific to Kouphovouno. These carinated bowls, which you see on the right with single stripes, tend to be a feature at Kouphovouno, not precisely paralleled at other sites. The absence of tall necks on jars, the rarity of very tall pedestals. There are small details which suggest there is a very specific style at Kouphovouno. So there were expressions of a sense of specific local identities, themselves framed by a larger territorial identity. And these expressions continue. We've distinguished 7 phases of the Middle Neolithic at Kouphovouno, covering perhaps some 300 years. And these specific local characteristics continue right through those 7 phases. Now, a minimalist view holds that a common pottery style, such as the Urfimis style in the Peloponnese, need not imply racial, tribal, linguistic, or cultural unity. All the same, the assemblages at each site are united not only by a similarity in decoration and the employment of closely similar techniques in forming and firing the vessels, but also a uniformity in the repertory of shapes, such as the carinated bowls, pedestal bowls, collared jars, and so forth. And these elaborately decorated vases are plainly for the consumption of food in a context of social display. It came, therefore, as a surprise to learn that there were differences in the subsistence remains from Kouphovouno and other Peloponnesian sites. Thus, at Kouphovouno, free threshing wheat predominated, whilst in contrast the gloom wheats, Triticum monococcum and Triticum dicoccum, were dominant at Franchthi, and indeed at most Neolithic sites throughout the Greek mainland. Also, our faunal assemblages differed from those of Franchthi. So these figures help illustrate the point that the picture of cultural unity suggested by the uniform pottery style in fact masks differences between one community and another as they adapted to their local conditions. And I think we can look forward to Stella Katzarou's talk tomorrow about the contemporary cave sites in Laconia, which no doubt had yet another adaptation to their maritime environment. What then the Urfimis style seems to represent is not a uniformity in the subsistence economy and the way of life bound in with that economy, but rather shared conventions of social intercourse, both within and between communities. And certainly a picture of peasants closed to the outside world and tied to their fields is not borne out by the evidence. Recent evidence of ancient DNA and isotope analysis has completely undermined the notion of static, conservative villagers hardly moving beyond the boundaries of their immediate surroundings. And these broader links of association are clearly signalled in the archaeology of our reason. Granted, imported pottery is far from common. On the left you see one sherd that, both from thin section analysis and from its appearance, seems to be an import, possibly from Boeotia or central Greece, where these sherds decorated with pellets are found, though the grey clay is, I think, I'm not sure, closely parallel, possibly at Chaeronia, but not elsewhere. I'd be grateful for any suggestions as to a close parallel. Here on the right we see examples from Elatia, but they're in a dark clay. But it's other materials which confirm the wide-ranging contacts, notably of obsidian from Melis, from Milos and the honey flints, whose origin are not clear, but certainly also travelled a long way to reach the Peloponnese. And I would mention here Catherine Perles's model, confirmed by the Franchthi material, which saw indirect supply of obsidian and honey flint via exchanges mediated through groups of specialists moving from village to village. And this, it strikes me, adds another level of territoriality, which we might call intercalation, groups of people distinctly different from those settled in the region, moving within and throughout the territories of the Middle Neolithic Peloponnese. This territory of long-ranging contacts is not confined to the procurement of chipstone artifacts. Another sign of shared culture can be recognized in the split-leg figurines found throughout the Peloponnese, Corinth, Kouphovouno, Isotopic, many other sites. But to a degree into central Greece, Thespiae and Otsaki, but with remote parallels into Bulgaria, Albania, and possibly even northern Serbia. The geography of these tokens opens up a landscape of very wide-ranging links, possibly tied in with the dispersion of Neolithic settlers throughout Europe. These connecting traits are not uniformly distributed. The so-called stamped seals predominate in Greece in the north, with only isolated examples in central Greece and the Peloponnese, Eutresis and Nemea. I can't think of other examples, there may be others. And they've been seen as a sign of an international spirit connecting Europe and Anatolia. But the stamp seals on the one hand and the split figurines on the other show only marginally overlapping territorial enclaves, widely dispersed across the Balkans, which used varying symbolic vocabularies. So far, I've tried to present a reconstruction of territoriality in Middle Neolithic Greece, which operated in a nested or segmentary fashion. Segmentary, thinking of brother against brother, but brothers together against the rest of the family against other families, but all families against the rest of the village against neighboring villages, but all villages together against more distant territories, and so on. And so both unity and division within the settlement at various levels, division and unity between primary and satellite settlements, to shared and contrasted identities across the whole province of the Peloponnese, and finally relationships with the wider world embracing central and northern Greece and the Balkans. And this construction forms the background to the next part of my talk and Chris's argument for a gradual transition from the Middle Neolithic to the Late Neolithic in southern Greece. Now, most scholars are agreed that the establishment of the Late Neolithic in the later part of the 6th millennium calibrated BC marks a major watershed in Greek prehistory. And again, I could quote many scholars on this. Bill Phelps again, Duzukli, Vitelli, Johnson, and many others have commented on this. At the same time, there's been seen a gradual expansion at this time into previously sparsely populated environments. Here, however, we wish to look at a much more restricted question, namely, how are we to understand the change in pottery styles and their territorial extent? In terms of the pottery styles, the smooth and rather conservative technological progression marked in the Middle Neolithic gives way to different and markedly new practices. And this has been emphasized again by Vitelli. She says the FCP3, Franchthi Ceramic Phase 3 potters had few, if any, direct ties with the Urfimis tradition, though she points to some similarities. All the same, the stratigraphic sequence at Kouphovouno points to a period when the production of Middle Neolithic Urfimis pottery continues alongside the new Late Neolithic and Black and grey burnished wares. I'm sorry for these confusing figures, but if you look at this central column, this is our earliest Late Neolithic phase, and you can see gradually as we get later and later, the amount of Middle Neolithic pottery decreases in proportion from 95% in the earliest Late Neolithic phase down to about 38% in the latest of this particular phase, and that then continues in the Late Neolithic 1 beta and 1 gamma phases. Likewise, if you look at this column, you can see that blackware starts as a very small proportion, 4.49%, and then gradually increases, reaching 50% at the end of this part of the Late Neolithic phase. And this blackware comes ultimately to, it reaches a peak in our phase 11 of 70%. And similarly, you can see in the right-hand columns how greyware, matte painted, and polychrome come only very gradually to dominate the assemblages. And there are, so this shows a blackware incurved trim. It's a new innovation. It doesn't show close similarities with the Middle Neolithic. And there are a few rarer types from Kouphovouno which may interest those who are obsessed with pottery. There's a little bit of black on red and a little bit of what looks like grey on grey, or possibly an imitation of grey on grey from Kouphovouno. Chris put particular emphasis on the appearance of blackware as the defining feature of the Late Neolithic, and we've seen how that came to dominate. And over the next few slides, I wish to mention three main points in particular. The first is the widespread nature of these innovations, what archaeologists have called a koine. The second is the gradual transformation of the pottery assemblage, which we've seen already. And a third consideration is what I shall term redundancy. So Weinberg and Theocharis have both referred to the ceramic koine at this time uniting Macedonia, Thessaly, Central Greece, and the Peloponnese with the appearance of certain types of black burnished pottery, for example. And here we see examples from Corinth, from Elatia in Central Greece, and dark burnished from Sitagri. And you can see the similarities between these really very distantly distributed sites. The old explanation of an influx of people bringing new types of pottery with them, either from Central Europe, favored by Maloycids, or from the East, suggested by Holmberg and Weinberg, doesn't seem to stand up. I guess there is a sort of schadenfreude with these things. Eventually, scholars were able to show that the great Maloycids was wrong in his dating of the Larissa period, the period of these that we're talking about at this stage, showing up a great archaeologist to be wrong. Though also, sort of rather ironically, it's now possible to show that the links that Maloycids recognized between Vinča, high up in Serbia, close to Belgrade, and Thessaly and southern Greece, are chronologically not necessarily so distant. Here we see some examples of, on the left-hand side, Vinča-style bowls from in blackware from the north, in fact from Hungary, and some examples from Kouphovouno. And again, you can see the similarities in profile, shape, and forms. And here, these forms are found both in redware and blackware in the Balkans, but also you can see how these pedestal bowls have a similarity, again, from the same site in Hungary and from Kouphovouno in the middle of the Peloponnese. Now, I must apologize for this. It doesn't read terribly clearly, but the irony is that Milojcic, who rejected radiocarbon dating, has in fact, to a degree, been supported by radiocarbon dating. There's been an extremely full study of the Vincia period by Whittle and colleagues, indicating, and you can see roughly the range for Vincia A, shown by those bars. And I've sort of shown our graph of Kouphovouno. Kouphovouno, late Neolithic 1A, was what you were seeing before. And you can see, if anything, it's probably slightly earlier, but about the same time as Vincia A. It doesn't maintain the priority of Vincia, but it does show that they occur at much the same sort of time. So there seems to be this long-reaching link and a major change in the appearance of the pottery at this time. Though, having said that, that conclusion needs to be qualified quite a lot. First of all, there are many types that are found in Vincia. Let me go back to this slide. The famous face-headed urns, such as you see in the central row there, bowls with incurving rimmed bowls and so on, anthropomorphic masks, amphorae, all sorts of things that occur in the Balkans are not found in Greece at all. It's only certain sherds that show this sort of similarity. I'm going a bit slowly, so I'll skip those slides. So the early Neolithic and the blackwares of the late Neolithic do not show a technique which was not available to earlier potters. There are examples of wares fired in this way from the early Neolithic and the middle Neolithic in Greece. But most scholars agree that these middle Neolithic examples simply show a similar technique. They are not the origins of what we see in the late Neolithic koine. And also scholars have emphasized the differences between one assemblage and another at this time. Thus, in eastern Thessaly, the black burnished wares form the most common of the fine wares, whereas in western Thessaly, they're not common at all, as Eva Alram-Stern has demonstrated already at Visviki. And indeed, not many pieces of blackware were found on Evia, again, as others in the room have shown. More scientific analysis is required to establish the provenance of blackware. Pentatheca has shown that the black burnish from Visviki was not local, but probably sourced in the Tianavos area in western Thessaly. So some of this distinctive pottery was produced by specialists and traded. And Vitelli has pointed to two different fabrics at Franchthi, suggesting perhaps imports. At Kouphovouno, Ian Whitbread is still at work on the thin sections here, but at the moment his preliminary remarks indicate, please don't tell him I told you this, that our blackware is locally made, and if anything shows a degree of continuity in terms of the fabric from Middle Neolithic into Late Neolithic. So there are technological innovations which appear to link the new styles across the Greek mainland, but it's difficult to indicate and isolate a single source of origin. And indeed, in spite of the marked changes, archaeologists have still recognized an important continuity at Middle Neolithic into Late Neolithic sites. And I've shown you the evidence for Kouphovouno to support this. Lavezzi refers to a peaceful transition from Middle Neolithic to Late Neolithic. The situation at Elatia is a bit unclear. Weinberg himself thought that there was a major change with the burnt house at level 1.2. Sorry, I'm getting over technical here. But there are arguments to suggest for continuity at Elatia. At Halai, Coleman has said, in general, the finds suggest considerable continuity of material culture throughout the Neolithic occupation at Halai. There are no sharp breaks before the final abandonment that may indicate the arrival of new people. And similar arguments have been put forward for many other sites in Thessaly, at Servia. It's nice to see Ken here, who's written about and again, I've got a quotation here, the proportion of fine LN pottery steadily increases. By phase 7, it may be that Middle Neolithic pottery is no longer being manufactured, but although phase 6 is transitional, it does not seem that new types developed at Servia. So, in summary, the case for a movement into Greece faces chronological difficulties. The number of sites whose pottery show a gradual rather than a sudden transition. It combines wares whose origins and background seem to be different, notably matte painted and blackware, and the package of pottery shapes and forms vary from region to region. Okay, so I'll stress those points now, and I'll come back to them in a minute. The shapes of the new wares are as important as the technique. Among others, there are bowls with sharply carinated carinated profile, flaring rims, incurving rims, all sorts of different things. The fruit stands, the pedestal bowls that we've seen. And it's noteworthy that none of them is restricted to blackware. They're made in greyware, and here you can see incurving rimmed bowls from Kouphovouno in blackware, top left, in matte painted, bottom left, in greyware, top right, and in polychrome, bottom right. So the potters of this period, of the same time, had distinct ways of decorating their pottery, but the types of vases that they produced at this time were very much the same. And this is what I mean by the term redundancy, which also raises a question. And it's clear that people throughout the Neolithic were sensitive to distinctions of style. Color, pattern, texture mark the regional Middle Neolithic styles, such as Urfimis, or the various which we see to the left, and the various styles of Central and Northern Greece, which we see in these examples, famous examples from Central Greece and Thessaly. So I don't think the new redundancy can be explained on functional grounds, nor is there simply a difference between patterned ware and monochrome. So we need to find some other way of explaining how these, the blackware, the matte painted, the greyware, and the polychrome projected some other value. Okay, and again, I'll come back to this in a moment. But I now want to move on and talk about another thing that Chris wrote about towards the end of his life, the famous so-called rhytons. These are vases which are found distributed throughout the Balkans. The very rough map on the right shows you examples from close to Trieste in northern Italy, throughout Dalmatia, Serbia, Macedonia, Central Greece, and down into the Peloponnese, and with scattered examples from elsewhere in Italy. Now, possibly the earliest examples, in fact, come from a site in Greece, the site of Achilleon, where they date to the earliest fragment dates to phase 2b, which would place it before 6000 calibrated BC. But these are shown on the left. But these are very different in decoration from the ones that we're familiar with in Greece. And here are examples from Bosnia and Croatia with various forms of decoration. Again, those in the Balkans can go back to early dates, almost as early, certainly the first half of the 6th millennium BC. So this is considerably earlier than the beginning of the late Neolithic period, perhaps some 500, 600, even 700 years later. So a point I want to stress here is that although the prototypes existed in an earlier period, the idea of producing the Rhytons was taken up in central Greece and the Peloponnese only at the time of the late Neolithic transformation. And this late adoption was not due to lack of contact in the earlier period, because we've seen earlier that there is evidence for contact throughout these areas at that time. But for some reason, the Rhytons didn't appeal earlier, but for some reason in the late Neolithic period, they were taken up as a point, and frequently taken up in the blackware that I've been talking about, though not produced exclusively in that. So how then are we to account for the koine, the sense that our large areas of Greece came together in an exceptional manner at the beginning of the late Neolithic period? And let's underline what was exceptional. For at least 1,000 years, pottery production in the Peloponnese, and indeed in various other regions of Greece, had followed a conservative tradition, each style evolving gradually from what went before. Here and there, specific types came in or went out of fashion. With the late Neolithic, there was not only a radical change in the appearance of the pottery, but it was widely distributed across much of the Balkans. A prominent but not only expression of this is the adoption of blackware. So a case can be made for black burnished ware being found in a territory stretching from Serbia in the north to the southern tip of the Peloponnese. How are we to understand this expression of territoriality in the context of the Neolithic? Let's contrast the larger range links of the Peloponnesian Middle Neolithic, the split-leg figurines. These witness not so much a direct imitation. The Albanian and Bulgarian parallels look nothing like their Peloponnesian counterparts, as a common practice. Whatever beliefs lay behind the practice of splitting the figurines apart, and there are competing theories, it was a practice that was held in common, not the precise form and decoration of the physical object. It was a practice. To this extent, the territoriality expressed a shared way of looking at an act, the breaking of a clay figurine in two. And this is different in nature from the territoriality expressed through the koine of pottery style and form found in late Neolithic Greece. Now, we would also argue that in the later 6th millennium, there are many different factors coincided. Firstly, some movement of population is clear, but rather than a large concerted mass movement, we would suggest that there were very many small-scale displacements scattered across the landscape. And I would suggest that there must have been a territorial context for such migrations. Through some political accommodation, such settlement and resettlement was able to take place within large regions. Crossing boundaries and moving into other people's territories is always a dangerous undertaking. The threat of violence must have been ever present. And it's surely no coincidence that towards the end of the Middle Neolithic and into the Late Neolithic, arrowheads and projectile points become an ever more prominent element in the chipped stone assemblage. To my mind, they are a sign of dangerous times. So I agree this is a controversial view. So when faced with aggression and the need to negotiate a pact, symbolic objects and ceremonial would also have been important. The exchange of gifts, the sharing of foods are also important means of averting conflict. And, for example, the adoption of the rite-on could be placed in this context. The prominent handles mean that they can be passed from person to person. Chapman has suggested that they contain salt, and again, salt has a symbolic value that's commonly recognized in many communities. So I'd like to suggest that the value of these new wares was as a symbolic vocabulary that was recognized across different cultural groups, stretching from the northern Balkans to the southern Peloponnese. In conclusion, therefore, we've argued that the territorial partition of the Peloponnese and mainland Greece helps us to understand the material culture of those communities who occupied the land. Looking first at the Middle Neolithic, I pointed to the different scales of territoriality, from individual buildings to household groups, to separate enclaves or neighborhoods within the village, to divisions in the farm fields, to major and subsidiary settlements, regional divisions, and vaguer but wider links across the whole of the Balkans. Furthermore, such territories were not impermeable. Individuals and small groups moved over considerable distances and were a means of maintaining communication over the peninsula. And this set the scene for Chris's analysis of the Kouphovouno finds and his observation of the gradual transition in pottery styles to those of the late Neolithic. We suggest that the realignment of population not only reworked the territorial fabric of Greece, but also faced the communities of the time with challenges to their sense of ownership of their land. Some settlements, such as Corinth, continued to flourish. We believe that Kouphovouno shrank in size, and other sites were abandoned while new villages were established. People were on the move. I'm reminded when talking about this of something that happened to Chris and me when we were directing the Kouphovouno project. We'd gone into Sparta on some important directorial mission. I can't remember quite what. We may have run out of string or something like that. Anyway, something very important took us to Sparta. And after completing that, we sat down at a Cavanagh to have a coffee to recover, and we probably discuss, I don't know, string theory or something like that. And as we sat there, a truck drove up, and the local farmer pointed to the back of his pickup, indicating that we could jump into the truck and go and help him pick his potatoes or his carpousia or whatever. Well, Chris and I hesitated for a moment or two. Who would know what would have happened if we jumped into the truck and changed our lives? Certainly our wives, Krista and Lena, would have been interested in the result of such a decision. But we decided not to take up this new form. But in a way, I like to think that this brings a modern view of how Chris and I might have joined migrant workers from the North Balkans to go and pick carpousia, or gypsies picking food, those ultimate intercalators, and how I don't like to make naive ethnographic parallels, but I think there's at least a hint of something like the sorts of things I've been trying to suggest in the course of this lecture. So we return to Chris's work and his inspiration. His fingerprints are all over this discussion. The relationship between material culture and territory, the excavation strategy at Kouphovouno that Josette mentioned, cultural transition and pottery. These are just some of the themes, in the feast that is to follow, and a fitting tribute to an inspirational scholar. Thank you.